well, thank you so much for your thoughts and here and so far. I would like to start with a question from the audience, actually. He was talking about how we want to like strategies to build agents that can be trusted by humans and are looking to like potentially different or find like romantic relations with. And given like recent news about sentience of AI, like the question was about whether we should be putting some limits.
So very quickly, whether it is actually desirable to have AI that we want to befriend and that we can like trust as humans, and whether we should be putting limits of different kinds, like whether legislative or whether there's like certain types of roles that we should be assigning on this AI, or whether we should be shaping the rewards accordingly to build some kinds of limits in that. Yeah, so I guess we can take it here, and if people on Zoom want to.
So I'm not a social scientist or like studying the humanities, but from the interactions that I had with people working in this field and me as a roboticist, what I feel like also when working with humans is that there should be some kind of ethical framework that should be developed that will somehow create some kind of norms to which any social robot should comply with, especially because if in the near future, all these companies that potentially they will create all these robots, the question is who is going to regulate them of what they can or cannot do. I could imagine that should be also country specific, or at least, there are different contexts of like social interactions between different origins of people. So I think that this is something that should be pushed in some sense. And I can imagine also having this would allow us, for example, different kinds of algorithms. For example, there is for collaborative robots that basically are in warehouses, and they can come in closed distances, and there are specific limits for velocity, distances, all these things. And these things do not apply for social robotics and assistive robotics. So for sure, there is a need for people to define some metrics and different rules and norms for, I think that there should be some kind of ethical legislation also framework for this in this sense.
That kind of stuff. I mean, I'm also curious to hear what the other Julian has to say. But on the part you mentioned on like, do we even want to have AIs that befriend humans? Something I found really interesting about Julian's talk is that he mentioned, he was like, one benefit of AI friends is that they will not disagree with you. They're just going to be on your side. And I was wondering, like, do we really want that? Like, what is the purpose of having friends? And it feels like sometimes you want to be supported, but also the role of your friends is sometimes to tell you, hey, you're wrong here. And all of that, I guess, got me thinking into like that we seem to value this idea of personalized AI that's really tailored towards us, but there's a certain value in having to interact with people who are kind of very different from us in some ways. Like, I think that's something that also, for instance, like can happen in academia. Like you hang out a lot with academics and then you kind of like forget how to interact with non-academics. Like I can't talk about my work outside because and so, yeah, I don't know. I'm just like widely speculating, but it made me think about like, you can imagine some wild future. You could say that it's great that you can have these agents that can really be your AI companions and really tailor towards you to the point that it just forces you to not have to worry too much about like the challenges that you encounter, really encountering a lot of different kinds of agents that might conflict and disagree with you and force you to kind of exercise your social cognition.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in as well, and I'm glad to be in the same room as another Julian. So, I think there's like a descriptive question here as well. So the question, I think the way it was framed is what should we do, prescriptive. But one thing you could also ask is how do people view these technologies? And at least one thing we found in our work is, for instance, if someone is wildly in love with one of these AI companions, people will say that that's addictive. Whereas when you're normally in love with another human, even though it activates the same reward centers that you normally see active during early intense love, people don't typically refer to it as addiction, which shows that actually the very use of the common sense notion of addiction has a value judgment built in, right? So if it's seen as improving you, it's not addiction. But if it's a deterioration, then it is. And we find that because of that, people are more likely to support regulation that disallows companies from allowing or creating apps where users fall in love with the app. And they would also spread like a negative word of mouth about these applications. So that's kind of interesting, just because it suggests, you know, to come, we might see regulation around this, where it's regulated kind of the way we might regulate addiction to games or other internet applications. But because of how we view AI companions, people might view it as a deterioration. And then the question about prescriptive, you know, what we should do, I think there it really depends whether the benefits are, you know, whether there are true benefits to the consumer. And one thing that I think is concerning always, but not just with these kinds of applications, but any kind of application, is that you have to worry about whether the incentives of the company align with the consumer. And so the company wants to keep you on the app, which you could say actually disincentivizes them from making you truly more socially adjusted. Because if you were socially adjusted, you wouldn't be on the app, you would be socializing with others. So that's something that we have to worry about, is whether the mechanisms for keeping people on the app are not actually helping them. And, you know, like Julian said, what we would have to ask ourselves, what is actually in the best interest of the consumer, and come up with ways for measuring, you know, for instance, whether their loneliness is improving, not just in the short term, but also in the long term.
Claudia, do you want to add anything?
I think maybe I'll take this question on the side of robotics and embodied platforms that can be companions or assistants at home. I mean, I think in that sense, it will probably have many implications, such as privacy and you know, the legalities of having an embodied moving agent in your house. But aside of those in which I'm less of an expert, I would like to comment that I would like these platforms to be seen probably as another tool in order to help and assist humans, and not as a full replacement. So as long as we manage to be able to understand that they are a tool, even if they exhibit some traits that are human-like or social, I think they can be very powerful in helping with real problems we have in society.
Victoria is here as well.
I am, but I have nothing to add to that.
So I guess as a somewhat follow-up, also related to some of the things that were discussed, we've been focusing a lot on like learning behaviors to interact with humans. And also in Julian's talk, like I guess that there was this talk about like this AI app. I'm wondering if in your experience, there's like anything fundamentally different when we interact with just a pure behavior versus when we make it embodied, and what are the considerations that take into account when we actually have a physical robot interacting with humans?
So yeah, I think it is different. I mean, I will tell you one example. In the last 2 years, we were doing all the Zoom meetings. I was seeing so many people as a 2D moving image, like a video. And now that I see them finally in the conferences, I cannot relate who is who. I may know the name, but I have, so maybe it's my perception, for example, that is not so good. But I've seen it also from other people, like basically it's completely different associating a person that you have seen in real life and you have interacted, you know, physically in some sense up to a point, and associate them with certain events, I think, rather than just an image that you you've seen. Of course, it depends on how long is the interaction that you have with this image, or like these AI companions that we were talking about. I think that the embodied agent has way more implications, and as a roboticist, I will agree that I would prefer that the humans would understand that this is a machine rather than an agent that tries to manipulate them. So there is all these concepts of like manipulation of the agents and whether or not this is ethical. For example, to make the human believe that this robot that may be anthropomorphic is a part of the society. And then like this brings up a broader discussion about what is an embodied society, what are the implications. So I'm not going to talk about the standard things like safety, the things that I also said before, but I think on a higher level, there are also other psychological aspects that could affect, for example, an elderly person thinking that, you know, the robot is their child or something like this. In my opinion, it will not be ethical to manipulate the humans in this way. And I think that the embodiment will adapt on the understanding, oh, this is a physical thing, it looks like a human. So depending also on your cognitive level, it may manipulate you differently. So it's a question of like, what do we want? How do we want this to go?
Yeah, I'll just weigh in to say that, you know, I think we can all agree that the full embodied version of a social companion is, you know, in some ways the ideal. But at least from I'd say there's two interesting angles here. One is from the business angle, of course, creating that is a long ways down the road. And so if you can create a compelling anthropomorphic software, then you can get there sooner. And you can also charge it as a software rather than as a hardware, which typically is associated with much larger margins. So, and you know, during the pandemic, I think that meant that many people were able to be cheaply given a tool, to use Claudia's word, which I agree with, to help deal with their loneliness in a way that was cheap and scalable and available. The other thing that I think is interesting here is that even in the absence of an embodied interaction, there is still a lot you can do, you know, just with software. And I think we've all experienced, you know, this sort of richness of text, you know, some people even falling in love without seeing what the other person looks like, because there are so many elements that convey social understanding and rapport. And I think there was a study even recently looking only at Zoom-like interactions, where the more interactive it is, the more you feel less lonely. So I guess I would just say that there's still so much one can do in terms of helping people, even without having a fully embodied agent. But you know, that would be the ultimate goal, I think.
I just wanted to say that it's a question like whether they are going to help them or they are going to manipulate them, and where is the fine line there? Like, I think that this is one thing. I don't know from a business perspective if this is something that it is considered, but I think from a social perspective or psychological perspective, like, I think it's something that we should consider. Like that you don't want a machine to write you, you don't want a GPT-3 to basically manipulate you in a way to fall in love. I mean, I can imagine that many companies will actually do this to make you addicted. But we don't want this, so they should be regulated, I guess, even if they are like completely virtual agents. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll quickly just respond because I think it's such an interesting issue. You know, what makes AI as agents so intriguing from a business standpoint, at least, is normally when you create an app, you're competing with so many other apps that people can buy instead. But if people view the app not just as an app, but as a friend, then suddenly they're much more sticky. They're going to stay on the application. They're going to keep buying it. They're going to spend the kind of money that they would normally spend on a friend. And so that does create, an ethical issue, I think. At the same time, there are people who are lonely. They want an extra tool. And in more extreme cases, they might really struggle to have companionship. And so for these people, the more real it might seem, the more it might feel as though they're less, just talking to an app, but truly socially interacting. So it's kind of this catch-22. And in fact, in speaking to some of the makers of these applications, the users often request for the apps to be even more real, more embedded, having these VR, AR options, being able to customize the AI. They understand that it's an AI, but they want to feel that it's, a person in some form. So on the one hand, you have what the consumers might even be telling you they want. And then on the other hand, you might have this nagging feeling that even that, in some cases, might not be in their best interests. So I think it's a bit of a conundrum. But it's true that loneliness, at least, does lead to all sorts of mental health issues. So it's not something we can sort of put to the side and say, we're only going to treat mental health symptoms when they get, to that point. We also need to think about, okay, if the everyday cause of some of these mental health symptoms is feeling lonely on a day-to-day basis, and if people can't access social interactions, how do we provide a tool in a way that's not unethical to them? And that also provides incentives for businesses to make such tools. Or maybe we should say it should be a nonprofit only. I mean,
I don't know if this is the point.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I just felt like there was, I wanted to connect the virtual Julian's point with the real person. Well, you're a real person as well. In real life, Julian, present in the room right now, that the virtual Julian just made a point about how if you create these AI apps, then it tends to stick a little bit more. And I guess that draws back to the currently in the room, Julian's presentation about whether you view the AI as having a mind or just being a role. So if you think about treating loneliness as having an actual like entity there that is learning about you, and that the experiences are local to the mind, just a role where you can swap out one person to evaluate your to help with your loneliness with any other person, then that's just a role. So I guess on that sense, I'd like to hear your opinion on Julian just spoke about.
Yeah, I'm liking this whole thing. Yeah, I guess I was thinking something similar. I don't know if I'll exactly answer your questions, but yeah, I guess I was thinking that I'm kind of just thinking on the fly. I don't know if that's exactly right, but in all this, I was thinking that we know that when you're building a model of another agent, there's some similarities in what you use when based on speech and physical action, but they're also different meaningful ways, right? People's choice of words or an AI agent's choice of words, you can use that to recover something about what's happening in their mind, but it's a different process. Like the way we think of like how an agent plans towards speech is different than how they plan towards action. And those themselves seem to be different. And just if you look at the kind of like evolutionary timeline, language is pretty recent. So there's been a much longer time at which we've been trying to kind of read physical action. And there's a bunch of evidence in cognitive science that we're really good, and all of those things seem to be very good and very powerful inferences that you make from physical bodies, whereas the inferences that you make from language seem to be a little bit slower and they seem to require a little bit more effort. Right, so these phenomena, like if you have actually a body, just the attention becomes super salient. And if you're just like staring at someone, right, like if you're in a room and someone is staring at you and you move and they just keep tracking you, you will immediately know something will call your attention and you'll feel kind of weirded out in some way. And there's also all of these other inferences, like there's this idea that we also tend to categorize agents in terms of competence and worms, that you can broadly think of competence like how big is your ability to change the world, and warmth is kind of like how kind are you to other people? Like how much do you care about others? And those inferences are clearly super salient and embodied agents, right? Like anyone who's interacted both with like a Roomba versus like one of those big robots that are like a use for machines that are just intimidating. Like you immediately feel the sense in which you don't want to get close to the big factory robots. I remember when I was in graduate school, I did a study actually on, I forget who was running it, but it was on robots that were trying to, the idea was that they could work together with people in factories, but the people were terrified of getting close to them because they know that if you just do the wrong grasp, it's just gonna totally crush you. So clearly like all of those inferences, having a physical body is just triggering all of these additional inferences that give it a lot more life, but I think it's a really hard computational problem that we need to solve. Yeah, so I guess like ultimately I think it's good, but or it's gonna give us a much richer sense that it has a mind and some kind of ability to exert changes on the world, but getting that right is hard.
Thank you. This is a question directed to Victoria's talk, but I think might be also interesting for the robotics people. So I thought it was very interesting to find that like kids adopt like non-egocentric representations in a natural way, and I guess that reasons could be like presence of oxytocin, etc. And in contrast, we have robots that we generally have to do like very task-specific behavior so that they adopt other people's perspectives. And so I'm wondering if you think that there are factors that would allow us to do like have robots that generally like take other people's perspectives independently of like the task.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the factors in infants are super complex, and so I'm not immediately sure how that would apply to robots. So I guess you mentioned the oxytocin component, and so is your question, can you repeat again your question?
By looking at maybe the reasons or what makes infants adopt other people's behaviors, we can like some of that can be transferred in designing AI systems that can also take other people's perspectives.
Right. I mean, as I said in my talk, the things that I think are crucial in infants is, or the thing that is most crucial is this initial absence of self-representation. Now, I know nothing about whether this is something that is even considered in designing robots, that you know, when you think about humans, that we have this very pervasive self-representation that contributes to our sort of difficulty in taking others' perspectives at times. And so I think that would be one of the important considerations, how we would, how you would think about that in terms of robotics.
A little bit of a kind of a follow-up question for you, Victoria. In your talk, if I followed the argument, I thought that you were saying, well, it looks like kids don't have self-representations or representation of themselves. But then in the task, it's not about whether they have to represent themselves, it's whether they have a first-person representation. So I guess it seems to me like there's a difference between having a representation of yourself versus a first-person representation of the world. And I was thinking that in the case of robots, it seemed like they come apart, because I would say most of these agents don't have a representation of the self, but they have a first-person representation.
Yeah.
So I was curious if you have thoughts, like how do you think those two connect in humans?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obviously true that you do not need to have a representation of the self to have a first-person representation of reality, right? So it is not necessary for me to perceive something to think that I am perceiving that. And that must be true. And so, you know, infants can perceive many things and remember many things without having to attribute them to the self first. The reason why I make this connection in the account that I present is because we know from adult literature that in the case of perspective taking, this is something that we seem to do. So there are studies that suggest that there is a process in which we transfer or translate our first-person representations into a self perspective. And so given that this is something that we do in adults, I think it's plausible that this is something that at least in babies would, and what I say in the paper is that in babies, what this could do is to strengthen the self-representation and then make it something that competes with the representation from the other perspective. So yeah, it's absolutely not the case that they need to be, that they're the same thing. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
No, I just saw that someone had
Oh yeah, I think, does Mehdi have a question?
Yeah, basically I have a question for Julian De Freitas, I mean also for everybody, about loneliness. Wouldn't not be better like to create a sort of AI who can connect like people who feel lonely instead of replace like social people or push like people to I don't know, go out, make social interaction with other people, and well,
yeah, it's a great point, and it sort of resonates with my previous observation that, you know, there could be cases in which the incentives for the app makers might be misaligned in a way that you wouldn't actually want to do that, right? So you could argue that a better use of these apps is to do exactly what you said, or even you create virtual gathering rooms where you can meet other people's companions and also meet other human beings. But I would say from a pure business model standpoint, if I'm making these chatbots, I'm not sure that that's going to be in their own interests. I guess another thought here is, you know, some of the relative advantages of the chatbots might still prevail in the sense that they're available anytime, and in their ideal form, they could learn about you in a more personalized way, where maybe in many of these chat rooms you encounter people very briefly. And to the other Julian's earlier point, while many people would actually prefer that their chatbot have more of a critical personality, for many others who need emotional support, who effectively use these apps as a kind of venting system or confessional booth, they might still prefer to have these kinds of validating personalities or to customize this. So, you know, I think there's still a role that these can play, and the fact that they're customizable, always available, not judgmental, means that they do have some advantages. But I also think you have a good point, which is, okay, if the ultimate problem is you know, loneliness, then isn't the ultimate solution to create lasting bonds with other people that will have other qualities that get you out into the real world, so to speak, and doing things and moving your body and so forth.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So one question I had is, in this workshop, we've like seen different scenarios and different tasks to evaluate like human-robot collaboration. I would argue that one of like the benefits of maybe having like common challenges and common metrics is to be able to compare like different methods and different baselines. I'm wondering what are your views on setting like a common set of challenges and metrics, and what these metrics could be, and whether there are maybe problems in terms of like biases or safety.
Okay, thank you. I think this will bring us closer to the, again, first of all, simulated environments and what tasks can be viewed as like human-robot interaction tasks. And then we have to think of all the range of applications of human-robot interaction, because the social perspective, for example, it's completely different compared to like I mean, there is always there, but you know, the shared workspace that you have to like build an assembly together with another human is different. So I think constructing, in particular for human-robot interaction, these kind of tasks and rules and metrics and definitions is not something that we can do only as roboticists or AI researchers, but it should be something that cognitive scientists, psychologists in general have to also give appropriate guidelines. And then the question is, how do you bring all these people together? I mean, there is, for example, the HRI conference, but I haven't seen, for example, any kind of big motion towards this direction, also because it's very difficult to simulate all the diversity of interactions. I really like the idea of having like a virtual reality system where the human can actually translate the behavior directly. And this could be something that we could potentially into the future, and given that these virtual and augmented reality technologies are going to enter more and more in our lives, to leverage, go around the world to collect data for human-robot interaction. But however, learning in real time from this virtual, I find it challenging unless like it's, I don't know, it's happening like in the cloud or something like this. And I think that in the end of the day, you are going to have a robot, hopefully, that has some kind of mean behavior towards some humans, and then there should be significant research towards personalization of the robot to its human or at least group of humans that is going to interact with. I don't think we will be able just in simulation to have all these things. Now, in terms of metrics, I can only think about, for example, it's easy for us as scientists to create this kind of objective evaluation metrics about collisions, about like minimum time to execute a task, smoothness of the trajectories. But then there is all these other parts, like, as I said, like the trust compliance, and there are all these objective evaluations that need to be taken into account. I could imagine that a human in the end judges, for example, and then you take this feedback as an additional labeling of the data collected, such that you can use this. But I don't see, I don't think we can have something where the human cannot give feedback. We have to integrate the feedback of the human at all cases. But yeah, it's I think a very big issue for pushing robot learning, for example, for human-robot interaction, how we can construct this kind of data sets, tasks in general.
I don't know if anyone else wants to. Well, maybe I'll just go quickly. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, we're kind of like in the era of coming up with challenges and benchmarks, and it's clearly successful in some ways. But I also think it's been good that it hasn't dominated social cognition yet, because it seems like what always happens is that once you have a challenge or a certain, like any kind of benchmark that you want to, any kind of like data set that you need to solve, people stop thinking about the original problem and just to think about how to solve that. And inevitably, once you solve that, it never actually ends up being the thing that you really wanted to solve. Like, we just don't know how to create a good challenge that really, like, it's really hard. I don't know how to do it, but like, no one's been able to come up with a challenge that, like, really, if you solve this, you'll be solving the real thing, unless the challenge were the real thing itself. And I think there's a lot of reasonable complaints that have been made about these kinds of approaches for things like object detection, when then the emphasis becomes on like, how can you get a small % improvement, and rather than like really trying to conceptualize like, what are the broader challenges? I think that's happened a little bit with social cognition with false belief tests. Like, it's true that for a while we were like, yes, so passing the false belief test is an important signature, but then there was all of this emphasis of like, we have a model that can pass the false belief task, and it turns out it could just pass the false belief task and nothing else. So I feel very conflicted in the sense that it seems like it would be really nice if we had some common challenges that we could say, here's kind of a battery of social tasks that we could run infants on, and children and adults, but also algorithms. But then the worry is, are we gonna stop thinking about social intelligence, just thinking about how to solve that challenge?
So quick addition here, for at least for the field of human-robot interaction, I think having benchmarks and metrics is definitely necessary, but not sufficient, right? And it's what I think Physical Julian was just saying. I think they are necessary because they provide an objective way to measure progress in terms of something that we have defined as a community, and we agree that is important, whether or not that is solving the ultimate problem. It allows to have a progress bar of some sense of over something, right? At the same time, we have to actively and explicitly avoid the trap of saying, now that is the only progress bar that matters, and then we stop thinking out of the box of what are novel and creative ways of looking at the same problem and maybe solving other challenges, right? So I think we have to go in that direction and use them, but keep aware that that's not the only thing. It's not only that number. Now, that being said, if we're going to have benchmarks and metrics for problems that involve human-robot interaction, that probably goes through this line of having simulation, right? Because if it is only physical, it's just very challenging to scale up and replicate across different labs. Now, if we go in this direction of simulation, then there's a question whether or not simulation is going to be enough to evaluate anything that is realistic in terms of human-robot interaction, right? I don't have the answer to that question, and you will find all sorts of opinions in the field about that. But I think it would be fair to say that in any case, whatever realistic or not is the simulation, that will be a subset of what real human interaction will represent, right? So if you give me a robot that cannot even avoid collision in a simulation with respect to a moving obstacle, right? Then if you cannot even solve that, how are you going to solve maybe shared workspace manipulation where you have to move around a human? The difference is that the human will have a particular distribution of how they move that might not be the one in the simulation, but is still, the simulation is still a subset of that problem. So I think if we challenge ourselves towards really going towards the end goal, these basic things that we can today set up in simulation as a benchmark are part of that path. And we need to work on defining them, solving them today, and make them increasingly challenging until we can actually solve them in real life with real interaction. So I think these kind of challenges are important, and I think they will become more important in the years to come. We already see some efforts, like mostly sort of combining the community on computer vision with the community of embodied AI, for example. We already see some efforts in that direction, but I think that will become super important, and I think we should use it.
To add upon what Claudia says, that I agree 100%. Yeah, I mean, I understand the worrying aspect of like only worrying about like solving the task like by some percentage and so on. First of all, it depends like what kind of subtasks you are creating, I think. So you can have, for example, challenges that are, more socially aware behaviors, subtasks of the whole behavior, because to be really frank, it's very difficult to solve with a single algorithm a whole behavior of the robot that you would like to have. On the other hand, I would still say that, not on the other hand, it's not contradicting, but I want to add that also the reproducibility, of course, in all the robotics is a problem, but in particular in human-robot interaction is a problem. And as I have worked a lot with real humans, I mean, in these experiments, it's always an issue of using and releasing their data. And also this depends on the country that you are, the law framework that you are in. So in the end of the day, you need to have this kind of good simulations. I don't know if it has to be kind of a challenge where people will compete to solve, but to be a general framework or frameworks where we can have more realistic interactions, at least with humans, I think it's necessary to solve some tasks. And okay, we saw like this, the application of iGibson or the virtual homes. There is, for example, assistive gym. There is this, what we are trying to do. So we are moving in this direction, but in the end of the day, you need to have something broader or some kind of rules of how you can do things, and then benchmark different methods that you could potentially then transfer and do some kind of real world evaluation with some human subjects.
So yeah, it's a short question because we're slightly over time.
So actually, it's hopefully a quick question. Although I did love AI as a gambling problem, was a fabulous notion. Anyways, if we're talking about people, right? People are very adaptable. And so for a lot of these applications, people will change their behaviors to accommodate whatever the robot limitations are. Do we have a notion of what people will not adapt to?
So I'm not aware of a specific like study or technical answer to this, but I would guess they don't adapt to things that are not useful, or they don't provide a value for us to make the effort to adapt to, right? If I have a very basic robot at home that can do a very, very basic task, it needs my help, but I actually need that help, then I would go, you know, the extra mile to accommodate whatever the robot needs or provide the information that the robot needs or so on, right? If the robot is doing a task that is not really helpful in my daily life, or like if it doesn't bring value, then the human doesn't adapt, right? That would be my guess, but curious to hear what other people are thinking about.
If somebody else wants to say something, but like one thing that I would consider again is whether or not they will adapt because they think of it as an embodied agent that has some kind of notion of understanding of some representations of the world and how to behave there, or is it a machine that has some skills and sometimes it can be stupid? For example, I get angry at my Roomba when it does weird things. Yeah, I will go to help it, but I know that it is a machine. And then when it will become useless, I will throw it away and buy a new one that will be more intelligent. But I am not treating it, for example, as my pet. So it's also, I think we go back to what will be the conceptualization of the robot such that we can, you know, adapt. For example, in my research with the mobile rollator that we were using with elderly people, the elderly people were frustrated by this huge robot that we have created when it wasn't complying or it wasn't helping. Or for example, when it was supposed this thing also to help them stand up from the bed, and it was actually not so easy because they had to apply force such that this gets activated. And so they would do it, but they were not happy with it. So it also matters, like it's another thing, I think, if it is a relationship, for example, between a friend or a kid, that you would adapt to it or like try to regulate it. And I think it's another thing of whether, yeah, we think of it as a machine or not. I don't know if you have a point.
Yeah, I have to know that I could share. I mean, mostly, yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm kind of fascinated by it. In cognitive science, something that we talk about in social cognition is that the way we seem to build models of an agent and an agent being like anything that's not an object. So I think we do build models of robots is, you know, by trying to posit some kind of like world models and reward functions. And some people have said like, well, a complaint about this is that it's kind of an unfalsifiable system that never fails. Like you can always, we were talking actually about this at lunch a little bit. You can always just come up with like an arbitrarily complex reward function that is always going to be able to explain the behavior. There's something actually economists, when they're also talking, and I don't know when this debate happened, I forget, but when it started with utility functions, they were like, wait, utility functions aren't a scientific theory because they're not falsifiable. You can always find an arbitrary utility function that's gonna work. But in social cognition, many of us have decided that maybe this is a good thing in our cognitive system because you don't want a system that will sometimes give you failures, that has like very sharp limits and saying like, if you act in a certain way, I just can't make sense. So it's really good to represent in terms of reward functions because it just allows arbitrary complexity. So that being said, like I wonder if maybe the failure is if there's a system that keeps kind of changing its reward functions or its utility function in a very unpredictable way, that might be the case where like we just find that kind of intolerable, because even though every time you can build something to explain it, if it just has no predictive power. But yeah, other than that, like, yeah, I think that's a really cool question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this adds too much, but I do agree that humans are very flexible, and I think they can probably adapt to most things. But then the question is, will they want to use that thing? You know, if like the representations that it's working with are so different from what humans are expecting. So even if they can adapt, that might not mean that they will actually in practice want to use that, instead of just going with, you know, the next best thing, like, which is, I don't know, like a human pet rather than a robot one. The other thing that I think is interesting is in the domain of great products that exist, but you know, you're dealing with how people perceive them because they don't yet know enough about the product. They haven't experienced it yet directly. And that can be quite challenging to solve. Like most people, if you ask them, they're not willing to drive in an autonomous vehicle. Okay, well, how do we get people excited about driving in them before the technology is, truly hitting the road, is that a problem that we can even solve? And I think that that's something that people are actively working on, and it's a little more challenging in that case, because you're having to deal with people's ideas of the technology that they haven't even experienced yet. So I guess my two thoughts is, you might experience technology and be able to adapt to it. That doesn't mean you'll necessarily use it. And then there might be technologies that you might not want to use, so you're not flexible, but you haven't even gathered the kind of evidence to make an informed decision. But nonetheless, you would still, rather go with something else.
Slightly over time. Thank you for people staying, particularly on European time zone. I just wanted to end by saying that, we are all agree on the importance of bringing the cognitive science and the robotics communities together, and we're trying to do these workshops to do this kind of stuff. But I wanted to get your take on what kind of things we can do to maybe improve collaborations or improve discussions among these two communities.
I mean, this is kind of fundamentally maybe bringing the fields together by, I could consider kind of a bottom-up approach where in the universities already they're established kind of, there are already some masters, I think, programs that are going in this direction of like cognitive and information science together. Depends how this curriculum is being built so that it is informed both ways. Then on the other hand, I can imagine of creating specific, there are these kind of conferences, but the question is what kind of progress are we making with these conferences, or whether there should be like smaller working groups or like events like workshops, summer schools, longer workshops that could lead to some end result. Like you want to design a benchmark, you create, I don't know, like a summer school in this direction, where groups will work together to produce something and not just, meet, tell our ideas, and then that's it. Because I don't think in this way we can progress. And obviously you can progress with funding, but also funding sometimes is rare. People change, people leave, and I think this makes it more difficult to come together.
Just to maybe I would say, I think more events like this one, but I was also thinking this would be a lot of work, but why there's no good like actual social intelligence conference. And there's just like so much work on social intelligence, but like all of the social perception people go to VSS, and then people like me that do kind of computational modeling with adults, we go to the Cognitive Science Society, and then the people studying infants go to ICUS, and then human robot interactions go to RSS. So it seems like we're all spread on like these little sub communities. I think the solution is just way too hard, but like it would be amazing if there were actually just like a social conference that brought everyone together.
I agree with the more events like this. I think it's been very productive, and I myself have learned a lot from the other talks, and just looking at the different perspective of different fields and understanding how I can incorporate that into my work. So definitely events like this. And then second, something that I think is useful is one of the main barriers usually of combining people from different fields is that we speak different languages in a sense, right? Or at least it's just the technical jargon is different sometimes. So sometimes I believe writing in a way that is friendly to other communities and putting materials out that explain our research in sort of more simple terms, or even teach or jargon and methods and goals to other fields might be a way to just having open materials that people might read and then become more familiar, and then create collaborations naturally. I think that could be a good way as well.
Yeah, I completely agree about what everyone said, including speaking the same language. And to borrow the other Julian's notion of roles, I think it's also helpful when you have real discussions about collaborations here and you understand that actually both parties have a lot to bring to the table. Like, for instance, in cognitive science, I think what we can bring is motivating why a particular phenomenon is worth studying from a psychological standpoint, let's say, and what kinds of paradigms capture that, and then what kinds of metrics to measure in humans that could then be, targeted on the modeling front. And then, of course, there's all the engineering challenges and state-of-the-art tools that engineering collaborators can bring. So I've found that in cases where people really understand that both parties have those roles to contribute, there's a genuine enthusiasm about doing this kind of work. And it's not about, oh, but you don't understand my literature, so you're irrelevant. But it's more like, okay, let's bring the best of both worlds and make something that's greater than the sum of its parts.
Thank you everyone for this. I think this has been really insightful, and thank you for your contributions.